Case 1. Grant Amato. 3 family members. 1 shooter. 0 forced entry. This is the case investigators called one of the most calculated familicides in Seminole County history. Welcome to Hidden Case Diaries. Every case you're about to hear is documented through court records, sheriff's office statements, and trial testimony. No dramatization. Just what the evidence shows. On the night of January 24, 2019, in the town of Chuluota, Florida, 29-year-old Grant Tiernan Amato killed 3 members of his own family inside their home. The victims were his father, Chad Amato, 59 years old, his mother, Margaret Ann Amato, 61 years old, and his brother, Cody Amato, 31 years old. At the time, Grant Amato was living with his parents. According to investigators, he had no full-time job and had become financially dependent on his family. What detectives later uncovered was a pattern of escalating financial deception that had been building for months before the killings. Grant Amato had developed an online relationship with a woman based in Bulgaria, whom he had met through a webcam platform. According to Seminole County Sheriff's Office investigators, Amato sent this woman over $200,000 across a 3-month period. To fund these payments, investigators say Amato stole $60,000 in firearms from his brother Cody. He is also alleged to have taken $150,000 from his father, which included a loan taken out against his parents' house without their full knowledge. When family members began to discover the scope of the missing money, tension inside the household increased. Investigators believe this financial confrontation is what led to the killings on January 24th. The case was uncovered after Cody Amato failed to show up for work. A co-worker, concerned about his absence, went to the family home to check on him. That welfare check led to the discovery of all 3 victims inside the residence. Seminole County Sheriff's Office deputies responded to the scene and began a systematic investigation. Crime scene technicians documented the interior of the home and noted that there were no signs of forced entry, indicating the person responsible either lived at the residence or had access to it. This detail immediately narrowed the scope of the investigation towards someone within the family circle. A neighbor living near the Amato residence later testified that she heard gunshots on the night of January 24th. This testimony helped investigators establish a timeline for when the shootings occurred, which they cross-referenced with other physical evidence collected at the scene. Ballistics played a central role in this investigation. A firearms expert with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement examined the weapons recovered from the scene and testified about the trajectory and sequence of the shootings during trial. This forensic analysis was critical in establishing that a single individual was responsible for all 3 deaths, rather than supporting an alternative theory that had been suggested, that Cody Amato had killed his parents before taking his own life. Investigators determined this staging attempt did not match the physical evidence. After the bodies were discovered, a search began for Grant Amato, who could not be located at the residence or through his usual contacts. Law enforcement issued alerts and conducted an active search across the region. He was located and taken into custody on January 26, 2019, 2 days after the killings. Once in custody, investigators built their case using a combination of financial records, digital communication logs, tied to the online relationship, ballistic evidence, and witness testimony. Financial investigators traced the flow of money from family accounts to the accounts associated with the woman in Bulgaria, establishing a clear motive rooted in the discovery of the theft. The case went to trial in Seminole County. Prosecutors presented the financial evidence, forensic ballistics testimony, the neighbor's account of gunshots, an analysis showing the crime scene had been staged to resemble a murder-suicide committed by Cody Amato. The defense contested elements of the prosecution's timeline, but the combination of physical evidence and testimony proved persuasive to the jury. On July 31, 2019, a Seminole County jury found Grant Amato guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The case then proceeded to the penalty phase, where the jury would determine whether to recommend a death sentence. Under Florida law at the time, a unanimous jury recommendation was required for a death sentence to be imposed. On August 12, 2019, the 12-member jury did not reach unanimous agreement on the death penalty. As a result, Grant Amato automatically received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at Hardy Correctional Institution in Florida. This case is frequently referenced in law enforcement training as an example of how financial forensics, bank records, wire transfer histories, and digital communication logs can establish motive in a family homicide case even when there is no history of documented domestic violence between the parties involved. It also illustrates how forensic ballistics analysis can dismantle a staged crime scene, correcting an initial theory of the case and directing investigators toward the individual actually responsible. The Grant Amato case remains one of the clearer examples of how a triple homicide within a single household was resolved through a combination of physical evidence, financial documentation, and expert forensic testimony, resulting in a first-degree murder conviction on all 3 counts. Case 2. Denise Williams. A husband vanishes on a hunting trip. 17 years pass. Then his best friend confesses and names the wife. This is the case of Denise Williams in Leon County, Florida. On December 16, 2000, 31-year-old Michael Williams, known as Mike, went missing during a duck hunting trip on Lake Seminole, west of Tallahassee. For years, the working theory was that he had drowned in the lake, with some investigators suggesting his remains had been consumed by alligators. No body was recovered. No arrests were made. The case went cold. Behind the scenes, though, one person refused to let the case close. Mike Williams's mother, Cheryl Williams, spent years writing letters to state officials, pressing for the case to be reopened. Her persistence played a documented role in keeping the investigation active long after most cold cases are shelved. In 2008, Florida's Division of Insurance Fraud opened its own inquiry into the case, focused on the life insurance policies that had been taken out on Mike Williams before his disappearance. Investigators noted that his wife, Denise Williams, had collected proceeds from multiple policies totaling $1,750,000. One of those policies, valued at $1 million, had been sold to Mike Williams by an insurance agent named Brian Winchester only months before he vanished. Brian Winchester was also Mike Williams's best friend. The insurance fraud investigation ran for years without producing enough evidence for an arrest. The break in the case did not come from the original disappearance investigation at all. It came from an unrelated crime. In 2016, Brian Winchester was arrested for kidnapping Denise Williams at gunpoint. That case put Winchester in prison and, according to prosecutors, ultimately led him to cooperate with investigators. In exchange for immunity related to the original homicide, Winchester confessed that he had shot Mike Williams in 2000 and that Denise Williams had conspired with him in the plan so the two of them could be together and collect the insurance proceeds. Following his confession, Winchester led investigators to Mike Williams's remains, which were recovered in December 2017, buried near a boat landing not far from where he had disappeared 17 years earlier. With Winchester's confession and the recovered remains, prosecutors were able to build a case against Denise Williams. She was arrested in May 2018. At trial, Assistant State Attorney John Fuchs presented the financial motive to the jury, describing how Denise Williams had collected on her husband's life insurance policies following his death. Prosecutors argued that the relationship between Winchester and Denise Williams, combined with the insurance payouts and Winchester's detailed confession, demonstrated a coordinated plan between the two of them. In December 2018, Denise Williams was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Brian Winchester, who cooperated with prosecutors, received a 20-year sentence for the armed kidnapping charge from his earlier case. The case did not end there. Denise Williams's legal team appealed the conviction. In November 2020, an appellate court reviewed the case and reversed both the first-degree murder conviction and the accessory after-the-fact conviction, ruling that the evidence presented was not sufficient to prove she had directly participated in carrying out the killing itself. However, the court upheld her conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. Following the appellate ruling, she was resentenced to 30 years in prison, reflecting the conspiracy conviction that remained standing. This case is often studied for how a 17-year-old cold case was ultimately resolved not through new physical evidence at the original scene, but through the pursuit of financial records tied to life insurance fraud, combined with a confession that emerged from an entirely separate criminal case years later. It also illustrates an important legal distinction that can arise in appellate courts. The difference between evidence sufficient to prove conspiracy in a killing versus evidence sufficient to prove direct participation in the killing itself. The persistence of investigators working the insurance fraud angle, combined with the mother of the victim continuing to advocate for the case over nearly 2 decades, ultimately led to a resolution most cold cases never receive. Case 3. Mark Sievers. A rental car with a GPS tracker. 2 men driving from another state. A husband who stayed home while it happened. This is how investigators built a murder-for-hire case from nothing but data. This is the case of Mark Sievers in Lee County, Florida. On June 28, 2015, Dr. Teresa Sievers, 46 years old, a holistic physician and mother of 2 children, was killed inside her home in Bonita Springs, Florida. She had just returned alone from a family vacation. Her husband, Mark Sievers, and their children had remained behind and were not present at the time of the killing. Investigators determined that Mark Sievers had orchestrated the killing of his wife. According to court documents, the motive centered on financial gain and fear that his wife intended to leave the marriage and take the children with her. Court records showed that the couple held 5 separate life insurance policies on each other, with a combined value exceeding $4,400,000. Trial testimony revealed that Mark Sievers recruited a childhood friend, Curtis Wainwright Jr., to carry out the killing, offering him a share of the insurance proceeds valued at $100,000. Wright, in turn, brought in a second man, Jimmy Ray Rogers, offering him $10,000 to assist. The investigation into this case relied heavily on digital and location-based forensic evidence. Investigators obtained GPS logs from a rental car that had been used by Wright and Rogers, which showed the vehicle traveling from Missouri to Bonita Springs, Florida, in the days surrounding the killing. This data placed both men in the immediate area at the relevant time. Surveillance footage from a local Walmart store further supported the timeline, showing the 2 men purchasing items investigators considered relevant to the case in the days before the killing. Cell phone forensic analysis added another layer to the investigation. Records showed that Wright and Rogers had been using prepaid phones, commonly referred to as burner phones, during the weeks leading up to the crime. One of these phones was shown, through cell tower data, to have been in the immediate vicinity of the Sievers home on the morning the killing occurred. The case advanced further when investigators spoke with Rogers' girlfriend, who told them that Rogers had confessed his involvement to her. She also led investigators to clothing that had been discarded following the incident, which was recovered and analyzed as part of the evidence chain. With location data, surveillance footage, cell tower records, and witness testimony converging on the same timeline, prosecutors built a coordinated case against all 3 men. Curtis Wainwright Jr. pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his testimony against Mark Sievers, receiving a sentence of 25 years in prison. Jimmy Ray Rogers was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Mark Sievers, identified by prosecutors and testimony from his co-defendants as the person who arranged and financed the killing, was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury in his case recommended a sentence of death, and he was formally sentenced to death in 2020. As of late 2025, post-conviction proceedings in his case remained ongoing, as is standard in Florida capital cases, which undergo mandatory appellate review. This case is frequently cited in investigative and forensic circles as a clear demonstration of how modern location tracking technology, GPS logs, cell tower data, and retail surveillance systems can reconstruct a precise timeline of movement across state lines, even when the person who ordered the crime never left his home. It also shows how cooperation agreements with lower-level participants in exchange for reduced sentences can be used to build a case against the individual who orchestrated the plan from a distance. The combination of rental car GPS records, cell phone tower pings, and surveillance video created a data trail that investigators were able to follow step by step, ultimately connecting 3 men across 2 states to a single crime scene in Bonita Springs. Case 4. Julie Schenecker. A military household, a husband deployed overseas, and a journal that investigators say revealed intent before the incident occurred. This is the case of Julie Schenecker in Hillsborough County, Florida. On January 27, 2011, Julie Powers Schenecker, a former Army linguist and military spouse living in Tampa, Florida, was responsible for the deaths of her two children while her husband was deployed overseas. Her son Beau was 13 years old. Her daughter Calix was 16 years old. Both children died as a result of the incident. In accordance with standard reporting practices involving cases with child victims, this account will focus on the investigation and legal proceedings rather than details of the incident itself. Following the deaths, Julie Schenecker was taken into custody after providing a confession to investigators. As part of building the case, investigators reviewed her recent activity and found that she had purchased a handgun days before the incident, a purchase that, under Florida law, required a waiting period tied to a background check. This purchase became a key piece of evidence, used by prosecutors to argue that the incident was premeditated rather than a spontaneous event. Investigators also recovered a personal journal belonging to Schenecker. Entries within this journal described her state of mind and intentions in the period leading up to the incident. Prosecutors used this journal as central evidence to support the argument that the deaths were planned rather than impulsive. The case moved toward trial, where the defense pursued an insanity defense on Schenecker's behalf. This required expert psychiatric testimony from both the defense and the prosecution, with mental health professionals evaluating her state of mind at the time of the incident and offering competing conclusions to the jury. The trial took place in Hillsborough County. Prosecutors presented the firearm purchase record, the recovered journal entries, and testimony establishing a timeline that supported premeditation. The defense presented psychiatric expert testimony intended to support the insanity defense, arguing that Schenecker's documented mental health struggles should be considered in evaluating her culpability. On May 15, 2014, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Julie Schenecker guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Following her conviction, her legal team filed subsequent motions seeking a new trial, arguing that she had received ineffective assistance of counsel during the original proceedings. These motions were reviewed by the courts and ultimately denied. This case is often examined in legal and forensic training contexts for 2 reasons. First, it demonstrates how personal documents, such as journals or written records, can become central pieces of physical evidence in establishing premeditation, particularly in cases where there is no other direct forensic link between intent and action. Second, it illustrates the legal standard required to succeed with an insanity defense in Florida, which requires proving that a defendant did not understand the nature of their actions or could not distinguish right from wrong at the time of the incident, a threshold that expert testimony alone is not always sufficient to meet in the eyes of a jury. The firearm purchase timeline, cross-referenced against the mandatory waiting period under Florida law, gave investigators and prosecutors a clear, document-based method of establishing the sequence of events leading up to the case, independent of any testimony or confession. This case remains a significant reference point in discussions of how documented evidence, from retail firearm records to personal journals, can shape the legal outcome of a case, even when a defense team pursues a mental health-based argument at trial. Case 5. Messac Damas. A one-way ticket to Haiti. A confession given to a newspaper reporter before police ever caught up with him. This is how one of Florida's largest single-family homicide cases was resolved. This is the case of Messac Damas, in Collier County, Florida. In September 2009, Messac Damas was responsible for the deaths of his wife, Gorline Dieu Damas, 32 years old, and their 5 children, at the family's townhouse in North Naples, Florida. The children were Meshach, 9 years old, Maven, 6 years old, Marvin, 5 years old, Megan, 3 years old, and Morgan, 19 months old. In accordance with standard reporting practices involving child victims, the details provided here focus on the investigation and legal proceedings, noting only the ages and outcomes of the children involved. Authorities stated there was a documented history of domestic abuse within the household prior to the deaths. Following the deaths, investigators traced Damas's vehicle to Miami International Airport, where records showed he had purchased a one-way plane ticket, paid for in cash, to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. This travel pattern, purchased shortly after the deaths occurred, became a key piece of evidence in establishing his connection to the case and his apparent attempt to leave the country. Damas was located in Haiti, and taken into custody by the Haitian National Police. He was subsequently extradited back to the United States to face charges in Florida. Before formal law enforcement interviews took place, Damas provided an account of the incident directly to a reporter with the Naples Daily News. He later gave 3 separate statements, each conducted under Miranda rights, to a United States State Department Diplomatic Security Service agent and to investigators with the Collier County Sheriff's Office. In these statements, he attributed his actions to what he described as bad spirits. The legal proceedings in this case extended over several years, largely due to extensive competency litigation. Before a case can proceed to trial in Florida, a defendant must be found legally competent to understand the charges against them and to assist in their own defense. Multiple competency evaluations were conducted in this case, involving forensic psychiatric professionals who assessed Damas's mental state at various points during the legal process. This litigation delayed the case significantly. In 2017, Messac Damas entered a guilty plea to 6 counts of first-degree murder. As part of this plea, he waived his right to have a jury determine his sentence in the penalty phase, a decision permitted under Florida law when a defendant enters a plea in a capital case. On October 27, 2017, he was formally sentenced to death. Following his sentencing, the case proceeded through Florida's mandatory appellate review process, which applies automatically to all death sentences in the state. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed the sentence. In 2025, the court denied his final request for a new trial, concluding the lengthy appellate process in this case. This case is frequently referenced in discussions of how competency evaluations function within the American legal system, particularly in cases involving significant delays between an offense and a final resolution. It also illustrates how digital and financial travel records, in this instance, a cash airline ticket purchase, can be used by investigators to establish a subject's movements and intentions in the immediate aftermath of a case, even when that individual has left the country entirely. The extradition process itself, coordinated between United States federal authorities, the Diplomatic Security Service, and Haitian law enforcement, represents a significant example of international cooperation in resolving a domestic criminal case, allowing Collier County prosecutors to bring the matter to trial despite the defendant's initial flight from the country. Case 6. The Montalvo Case. An excavator on a family property. Neighbors who noticed, and a text message investigators say was sent by someone other than the woman who supposedly wrote it. This is the case surrounding the death of Nicole Montalvo in Osceola County, Florida. Nicole Montalvo, 33 years old, a mother living in St. Cloud, Florida, went missing on October 21, 2019, after dropping off her young son at a property belonging to her estranged husband, Christopher Otero Rivera, and his father, Angel Luis Rivera. Her remains were later recovered from the Rivera family property in October of that same year. Prosecutors stated that the 2 men wanted Montalvo to, in their words, disappear, so that Otero Rivera could gain sole custody of the child the 2 shared. Investigators noted a documented history of domestic violence between Montalvo and Otero Rivera prior to her death. The investigation began after neighbors near the Rivera property noticed an excavator being used on the land, which prompted concern and led to a formal search of the property. Investigators, working with forensic search teams, ultimately recovered remains buried at 2 separate locations on the property. During the investigation, prosecutors alleged that Angel Luis Rivera, the father, sent a text message while posing as Montalvo herself, in an apparent effort to create the impression that she was still alive and had simply left the area. This digital evidence became a significant part of the case against him, demonstrating an attempt to delay or misdirect the investigation. Forensic evidence collection in this case faced early complications. A DNA report on blood found on the garage floor of the property showed that it did not match Montalvo, which required investigators to expand and adjust the scope of their forensic search across the rest of the property before ultimately locating her remains elsewhere on the land. Investigators and forensic search specialists testified at trial about the methods used to locate and recover the remains, describing the systematic search process used across the property once the excavation activity had drawn attention to the location. In April 2021, an Osceola County jury found both Christopher Otero Rivera and Angel Luis Rivera guilty of second-degree murder, abuse of a dead human body, and tampering with evidence. In July 2021, the presiding judge sentenced both men to life in prison, along with additional consecutive years for the remaining charges related to abuse of a dead human body and tampering with evidence. This case is often studied for its demonstration of how community observation, in this instance neighbors noticing unusual excavation activity, can directly trigger a law enforcement search that leads to recovering physical evidence in a case. It also highlights the role of forensic DNA testing not just in confirming a match, but in ruling out an initial theory, redirecting an investigation, and ultimately leading investigators to the correct location. The alleged use of a text message sent from the victim's phone after her death in an attempt to simulate ongoing communication is also frequently referenced as an example of how digital evidence, including message metadata and timing, can be scrutinized by investigators and used to demonstrate consciousness of guilt on the part of those involved in concealing a case. Together, the excavation discovery, the DNA analysis process, and the digital communication evidence formed the foundation of a case that resulted in convictions against both men involved. Case 7, the Todd case. A missing hospice nurse, a husband who passed a polygraph test, and a plea deal that led detectives straight to the location of her remains. This is the case surrounding the death of Tricia Todd in Martin County, Florida. Tricia Todd, 33 years old, a hospice nurse and Air Force veteran, disappeared on April 27, 2016, in Hobe Sound, Florida. She was last seen at a local Publix grocery store before she went missing. Her ex-husband, Stephen Williams, 30 years old, a United States Airman stationed in North Carolina at the time, later confessed to being responsible for her death and for disposing of her remains near Jonathan Dickinson State Park. The two shared a young daughter, and investigators noted a documented history of financial disputes between the former couple prior to her disappearance. The investigation required extensive coordination across state lines, as detectives with the Martin County Sheriff's Office in Florida made repeated trips to North Carolina to interview Williams, who was stationed there with the Air Force at the time. In initial interviews, Williams cooperated with investigators and even passed a polygraph examination. However, as the investigation continued, detectives identified what they described as gross inconsistencies in the account he had given them, which led them to continue pursuing him as a central figure in the case, despite the earlier polygraph result. As part of a negotiated plea agreement, Williams agreed to lead detectives directly to the location of Tricia Todd's remains. Investigators confirmed that the location matched information provided during the plea negotiation process. According to statements from the Sheriff's Office, laboratory analysis and reconstruction related to a chemical substance used in connection with the case allowed investigators to confirm that all remains had been fully recovered. The interstate nature of this investigation illustrates the coordination required between local Florida law enforcement and out-of-state authorities when a suspect resides or is stationed in another jurisdiction. Detectives had to balance building rapport and trust with Williams during interviews, in hopes of securing cooperation, against the ongoing forensic and circumstantial case being built independently by investigators back in Florida. In September 2016, Stephen Williams pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison, along with a concurrent 5-year sentence related to a charge of child neglect connected to the case. This case is frequently referenced in discussions of polygraph limitations within criminal investigations. While Williams initially passed a polygraph examination, investigators continued pursuing inconsistencies in his account, rather than treating the polygraph result as conclusive, a decision that ultimately proved correct once his confession was obtained. Polygraph results are generally not admissible as evidence in Florida courts, specifically because of this kind of unreliability, and this case is often used to illustrate why investigators are trained not to rely on them as a determining factor. The case also demonstrates the practical value of negotiated plea agreements in cases where remains have not yet been located. By agreeing to a specific sentence in exchange for cooperation, prosecutors were able to secure the information needed to recover Tricia Todd's remains and provide closure to her family, an outcome that might not have been achieved as quickly, or at all, through continued investigation alone. The combination of persistent interstate investigative work, careful handling of inconsistent testimony, and a negotiated agreement to recover evidence ultimately allowed this case to reach a resolution. Case 8. Adam Matos. 4 members of one household. A killer who stayed in the home for days afterward, and a young child who was found unharmed in a Tampa hotel room. This is the case of Adam Matos in Pasco County, Florida. In late August 2014, Adam Matos was responsible for the deaths of 4 people at a home in Hudson, Florida. The victims were Megan Brown, his former girlfriend and the mother of his child, along with her parents, Gregory Brown and Margaret Brown, and Megan's new boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard. The family had recently relocated to Florida from Pennsylvania. According to investigators, Matos remained inside the home for several days following the deaths, before eventually moving the bodies and leaving the area, traveling to Tampa, Florida, with his young child, who was not harmed during the incident. The case came to the attention of law enforcement on September 4, 2014, when deputies responded to the home at the request of a family member who had grown concerned. Upon arriving, deputies discovered 4 bodies located in a field on the property. Following the discovery, investigators launched a search for Matos and the child. Both were located at a hotel in Tampa, Florida. The child was confirmed to be unharmed and was placed with family members following the discovery. At trial, testimony established that 2 of the victims died from gunshot wounds, while the other 2 victims died from injuries caused by a hammer. Matos testified in his own defense, telling the jury that he had acted in self-defense during the incident. The prosecution presented physical evidence and testimony from the crime scene, along with the timeline established through the discovery of the bodies and the subsequent search for Matos, to counter this claim. In November 2017, a Pasco County jury convicted Adam Matos on 4 counts of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, the jury voted 11-1 in favor of recommending a death sentence. However, Florida law at the time required a unanimous jury recommendation for a death sentence to be imposed. Because the vote was not unanimous, Matos automatically received a sentence of life in prison instead. This case is frequently referenced in discussions of Florida's jury unanimity requirement for capital sentencing, a legal standard that has direct and significant consequences on case outcomes. Despite an overwhelming majority of jurors favoring a death sentence, the requirement for a unanimous decision meant the case resulted in a life sentence instead, illustrating how procedural requirements can shape the final outcome of a case, regardless of the jury's overall sentiment. The case also demonstrates the investigative complexity involved when a suspect remains at a crime scene for an extended period before fleeing. The several-day gap between the incident and the discovery of the bodies required investigators to reconstruct a timeline using a combination of the initial welfare check, physical evidence from the scene, and the eventual location of Matos and the child in Tampa. The successful, unharmed recovery of the young child is also frequently noted in reviews of this case as a positive outcome amid an otherwise difficult investigation, reflecting the priority law enforcement placed on ensuring the child's safety throughout the search and eventual apprehension process. Case 9. Dalia DiPolito. An undercover officer posing as a hired killer, a staged crime scene, and a television camera crew capturing it all in real time. This is the case of Dalia DiPolito in Palm Beach County, Florida. In 2009, approximately 6 months into her marriage, 26-year-old Dalia DiPolito solicited the murder of her husband, Michael DiPolito, 38 years old, in Boynton Beach, Florida. Prosecutors stated that her motive centered on gaining control of the couple's shared townhouse and his personal savings. This case is distinct from the others featured, as it involves a solicitation of murder rather than a completed killing, and it offers a clear example of how law enforcement can proactively intervene before a planned homicide takes place. The investigation began after DiPolito approached a former boyfriend, Mohammed Shihadeh, seeking assistance in her plan. Rather than participating, Shihadeh alerted the Boynton Beach Police Department to what she had proposed. Working with this information, police launched an undercover operation. An undercover officer was introduced to DiPolito, posing as a hired individual willing to carry out the killing. During recorded meetings, DiPolito discussed and paid this undercover officer to carry out the killing of her husband. These interactions were captured on both audio and video recording equipment as part of the sting operation. To complete the operation and secure sufficient evidence, police staged a fake crime scene at the townhouse, designed to appear as though the killing had been carried out. Officers then brought DiPolito to the scene and recorded her reaction upon seeing it. A film crew from the television program Cops was present and documented portions of the operation as it unfolded. Following her arrest, the case proceeded through an extended legal process spanning several years and 3 separate trials. An initial conviction, obtained in 2011, was later reversed on appeal. A subsequent trial ended without a verdict, resulting in a hung jury. Following this multi-year legal process, Dalia DiPolito was ultimately convicted of solicitation of first-degree murder. In 2017, she was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Appellate courts subsequently reviewed the case and declined to overturn the conviction. This case is widely referenced in law enforcement and legal training as one of the clearest examples of a proactive sting operation successfully preventing a planned homicide before it occurred. The use of an undercover officer posing as a hired participant, combined with comprehensive audio and video documentation of the transaction, created a body of direct evidence that was central to the prosecution's case across all 3 trials. The involvement of a television production crew during an active law enforcement operation also makes this case a frequently discussed example in conversations about the intersection of media documentation and ongoing criminal investigations, raising questions that were addressed at various points throughout the extended legal proceedings. Ultimately, despite the legal complexity introduced by the initial reversed conviction and the subsequent hung jury, the case demonstrates how a solicitation of murder charge can be successfully prosecuted when supported by direct recorded evidence gathered through an undercover sting operation. Case 10, Justin Barber. A staged robbery on a beach, self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and an internet search history that told a very different story than the one he gave police. This is the case of Justin Barber in St. Johns County, Florida. On August 17, 2002, Justin Barber, 30 years old, reported that he and his wife, April Barber, 27 years old, had been attacked by a robber on a beach near Guana River, south of Ponte Vedra, Florida. April Barber died from a gunshot wound to the face. Justin Barber sustained 4 gunshot wounds, which he described to investigators as having been inflicted by the robber. As the investigation developed, investigators concluded that Justin Barber had staged the scene himself and had inflicted his own injuries in a manner designed to appear consistent with an attack. The financial motive identified by investigators centered on life insurance. The couple had purchased matching life insurance policies on each other, valued at $2 million each, in 2001, roughly 1 year before the incident. Following the case, April Barber's family pursued legal action in an attempt to block the payout of her policy, which investigators had identified as the underlying motive for the case. The forensic investigation in this case relied on several distinct disciplines. A detective with the case, identified in court records as Detective Cole, led an analysis of blood transfer patterns at the scene, along with ballistic evidence and injury patterns that investigators determined were inconsistent with Justin Barber's account of being attacked by a stranger. Separately, digital and computer forensic analysis became a central component of the case. A forensic computer expert, identified in court records as Jim Stafford, recovered internet search history from a computer Justin Barber used at his workplace. These searches were related to the effects of gunshot trauma to the chest, conducted prior to the incident, which prosecutors argued demonstrated premeditated research into how to survive the very type of injuries he later claimed to have sustained during a robbery. A forensic computer analyst also testified regarding a set of 16 audio tracks that had been downloaded onto the same computer on the day of the incident. These files were later deleted from the computer approximately 2 weeks after the incident occurred. Among the 16 tracks was a song by the band Guns N' Roses titled "Used to Love Her, But I Had to Kill Her." This detail was presented to the jury as part of the broader circumstantial case establishing Justin Barber's state of mind before and after the incident. Justin Barber was arrested in 2004, roughly 2 years after the incident, following the extended forensic investigation. His trial began in June 26, held in St. Augustine, Florida. The case presented to the jury was described as wholly circumstantial, meaning there was no direct eyewitness testimony placing Justin Barber in the act of committing the offense. Instead, the prosecution's case relied entirely on the combination of forensic blood pattern analysis, ballistic evidence, digital forensic recovery of internet search history, and the recovered and later deleted audio file evidence. The jury convicted Justin Barber of first-degree murder with a firearm. He was sentenced to life in prison. His conviction was subsequently upheld on appeal in the case of Barber versus State, decided in 2009. This case remains a frequently cited example of how digital forensic evidence, specifically internet search history and file download records recovered from a personal computer, can establish premeditation and state of mind in a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. It also demonstrates how blood pattern analysis and ballistic reconstruction can directly contradict a suspect's account of events, even when that account initially appears consistent with the physical injuries present. The successful prosecution of this case without any direct eyewitness testimony highlights the growing role that digital forensics has played in resolving cases since the early 2000s, establishing precedent for how computer-based evidence can be gathered, authenticated, and presented in court. That closes out all 10 cases featured in this documentary. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider supporting the channel by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and hitting the subscribe button so you don't miss the next case file from Hidden Case Diaries.